In this video, we'll create a few particle systems to create visual polish in our game, as well as add a few sound effects. So far, we have just had solid objects in our game world. A particle system allows you to simulate fluid-like entities such as fire, smoke, and clouds. The larger visual effect of the particle system is achieved by having many simple 2D images or 3D meshes moving together. Our objectives include using Unity's particle system to create a simple explosion of sorts for the player, coin, and enemy game elements. We will also add sound effects to go along with each particle system. Ultimately, we will add the resulting effects into the game. So let's go ahead and set up a particle system for our player explosion. So under the hierarchy, let's select Create, and Particle System is actually an option here. So let me select that to create the particle. And you can see it creates a particle system game object, and you can see it's emitting particles out in my world, sort of these white glowing balls floating up. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this as my explode player particle. And particle systems are a thing that you sort of just have to play with and kind of see the visual results. When the particle system is selected here, you can see it's sort of previewing. There's a particle effect option down here where I could pause it or start it playing again. I can stop it and so forth. I can play with the speed and the playback time and so forth to see the results there. When I unselect that, it just freezes at the last setting. So particle systems are a great way to sort of iteratively test in the editor the sort of results of that. So over here in the components, I'm going to kind of expand this a little bit. You can see that particle systems are just a component on a game object, and they've got several different little tabs here that you can open and close. So there are literally hundreds of things that you can play with, and if you roll over these, a little tooltip will pop up that'll explain what it does. So duration, for example, is how long does the particle exist. Right now it's 5 seconds. Let me switch this to 1. So obviously I played a while to kind of figure out what settings that I want previous to this demo. Otherwise we would take forever here. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk through the options that I've selected. So the start lifetime I'm going to set at 1, so they only last a second. The start speed I'll leave at 5. The start size I'll leave at 1. Start rotation at 0. I'm going to give it a little bit of gravity. So rather than 0, I'll set to 0.5. And you can see that visually they're kind of coming up and then falling off a little bit. Let me go down to emission. Emission sort of defines how fast things are emitted. If I set the rate to 0, you can see that nothing's being emitted, which is actually what I want because I just want to set a burst at the beginning for this sort of explosion to happen. So down here it says burst. Let me click plus, and I want a burst of, let's say, 20 particles right at time 0. Because it's sort of the player falling off the world or getting hit by an enemy, and they're just going to sort of explode into pieces. So the next option is shape. Shape defines the shape of the particle system, and notice it's got this cone that sort of defines that shape. There's various options here, including sphere. You can see that visually represented, so it's going to shoot out in all directions. I actually kind of like hemisphere for this, so it's kind of a dome. Where things are coming out. So they're all sort of shooting up, but around the area. So let me close these up as I go. Let's go down to size over lifetime. And I'm going to turn this one on. And I want to basically have the particles get smaller over the life. So let me go ahead and click on the size. This actually brings up this curve editor down here. And I could just basically drag the endpoint down. Or there's sort of these presets that you can select. So you can see now over the life they start big and then they get smaller. So I'll close that up. The last thing that I want to modify is the renderer. So the renderer defines what's actually rendered, and that's what's kind of setting these sort of white things coming out. Right now it's set at the render mode is billboard, which is sort of a billboard are like 2D images are sort of emitted out of this particle system. And very often that's really what you want. You want to emit a bunch of 2D images to make the look of smoke or fire or that sort of thing. But for this particle, we actually want it to look like our rollerball is blowing into pieces. So I'm going to change from billboard to mesh, because we're going to actually use the mesh of the rollerball in our explosion. So once you have mesh, you can pick the mesh to use, just defaulted to cube. Let me pick the little target. These are all the meshes in our world. I'm going to select rollerball. And then of course, I also need to set the material of my rollerball. So right now it's just a default particle material. Let me go ahead and choose my rollerball material. And you can see the effect out here. It looks like a bunch of little roller balls exploding. Okay, we've got our particle system set up the way we want. Like I said, you could play with this for hours literally if you wanted to get different effects. But I'm pretty happy with what I have there. The other thing that I want to add to this game object is an audio source, because with the particle system, I actually want to play a sound effect. So let me go ahead and add a component to this. I want to add an audio source. And go ahead and open that. I can close the particle systems if I want to. And let's go ahead and add a sound effect. So I actually do have a sound effect called Player Explosion that will play. And I don't need to change any options. I'll just go full volume. It's not going to loop or anything like that. And basically the way that this game object is going to work is every time the player dies, it's going to add this particle system to the world and play the sound. So, one thing that you start to have is you start to get a lot of game objects in your world when you do things like explosions and that sort of thing. So I actually want the game object to clean up after itself. So let me go and click Add Component, Scripts, and there's a script in here called Timed Object Destructor. So let me pick that, and basically what this will do is it'll destroy the game object after a set of time. So I'm going to say after a timeout of 3 seconds, I want it to kill itself. I want it to destroy the game object from the world to sort of clean up after itself. Otherwise, you might get, many particle effects out in your world. Not necessarily for the player, since you only die once, but for the other objects that we're going to work with. So we have this set up. I'm going to go ahead and make this into a prefab. So I'll drag it over to my prefabs. So it's my explode player particle. And I don't want it to actually exist in my world initially. I only want it to come out at the appropriate time. So I'm going to go ahead and Command or Control Delete to get rid of the game object. If I ever want to edit it again, I can just drag the prefab out and then edit it and then apply it back to the prefab. So I'll delete that. So let me go to the rollerball and scroll down to the health. And we have this explode prefab. So this is where we want to actually set that explode player particle. So let me drag it down there. So let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to let the enemy hit me. So you can see the particle played, but actually look, it's actually looping. So it played 3 times before it destroyed itself. So I need to fix that, obviously. So it's one of the settings that I didn't set properly. So let me go ahead and bring out the particle system and open it up. And notice there is this looping option, so let me turn that off so it's not looping, and then apply it back to the prefab. And then, of course, I can delete it out of the world. So let's play again.
Game over.
Okay, that's the exact effect I want. I want it to blow up one time when the player dies. So now that we have the player explosion, we can quickly make additional particle systems for the coin and for the enemy. So I'm going to basically take that prefab and duplicate it, and I'm going to rename it Explode Coin Particle. And you can also edit the properties directly on a prefab. So with the prefab selected, I could come over here to the inspector and make the appropriate changes. So one of the things I want to change is the start size. So rather than 1, I want to make it a little bit smaller. So I'll do 0.2. Let me go down to the emissions. Rather than 20 particles, maybe only 10 for the coins when you run into them. And then at the bottom, the renderer, of course, I don't want the coin to blow up. I want it to be, I don't want the rollerball to blow up. I want it to be the coins. So I can go ahead and click the target, select the pickup mesh, and then change the material. So I'm going to go ahead and use the coin material. So that particle system is now set up. Of course, I probably want a different sound effect on it. So let me go into the audio source And rather than the player explosion sound effect, I'll use the coin explosion sound effect. And once again, I'll keep the timed object destructor. So let me go to a coin to attach it appropriately. So let me just select one of the coins in the world and go down to the treasure script. It has an explosion prefab option. So let me go ahead and drag the explode coin onto that. So that'll just be on this individual game object. And of course, if I click apply, it'll apply it back to the prefab. So let's go ahead and test.
Game over.
All right, we're starting to get a lot of nice visual effects in our game and sound effects. So lastly, let's do the same for the enemies. So I'm going to go back to my original explode player particle and duplicate this, rename it to explode enemy. I'm going to leave pretty much all the settings the same except for the renderer. So rather than the rollerball mesh, I want it to be a cube. So I'll just select the cube here. And for the material, I want to choose the enemy material. And once again, I'll modify my sound effect. So go down to audio source, select the enemy explosion sound, and leave everything else the same. So now I need to go to my enemy game object and set this up. So there's actually two places that I can place this explosion. One is on damage. So when the enemy runs into the player or into another enemy, I want it to destroy itself. So I can check this self-destroy on impact and then add the enemy particle effect to that. And also on health, so when it loses health, I also want it to play that particle effect. And I noticed I made a typo here, so I could go ahead and correct that. Unity's smart enough that it always keeps things linked, which is nice. So let's go ahead and test this. So if I run into one of these guys, we both explode. In the next video, we'll add a simple animation to our game.